Hello, I'm Reilly Morse with the Mississippi Center for Justice, and today I'm going to share with our colleagues here in Puerto Rico some issues and strategies on how to approach federal disaster relief funds after Hurricane Maria. These draw on lessons learned from 5 years of advocacy after Hurricane Katrina. And for me, that story began on the day of the storm and right afterwards, where you can see that the storm destroyed my shoreline office. And within a matter of a few months, I was recruited to help put together a disaster recovery office in the adjacent city of Biloxi, Mississippi. And from there to the next slide, which is a moment of announcing a long and hard-fought success with HUD Secretary Sean Donovan and Governor Haley Barbour, came a large amount of advocacy over affordable housing recovery, over federal block grant requirements, and a lot of work in alliances, following the money, tracking the housing recovery promises and the delivery. And here's a photo of some of those who participated in that success. Now, we were dealing with many thousands of people displaced, and there always is a very last person on the list. And I think it's always important when you start on this work that you think about that last family. This is the Foths. They lived in that trailer on the left in the woods north of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and the hurricane destroyed their trailer and left them living for a while in that car and then later in those sheds you see behind their car. Ultimately, though, after a long and hard fight, we were able to put into place an unmet housing needs recovery program that put them into their own home in a replacement trailer where that other one was. And they now live what we could call something like a normal life again. But that was something close to 7 or 8 years after the disaster. And for them, justice delayed is justice denied, it seems. Here is a synopsis of how the work emerged and grew and then waned over the course of about 10 years. At first, we had a couple of simultaneous waves. There were spikes of evictions, first out of private rental housing, and then afterwards out of FEMA trailer parks and individual FEMA trailers as Congress went all the way up to the deadline in order to renew certain FEMA appropriations. Alongside that was a large amount of humanitarian benefits that came out through the Stafford Act, and for which we leaned heavily upon pro bono partners to help us make sure that folks in complete and utter devastation and distress had some level of support. Next came a long fight over affordable housing advocacy that took many forms and attacked many facets of the problem, both owner-occupied and rental, private market and federal subsidy, and hybrids like transitional housing. Once the housing money began to flow, we worked to help people who were eligible for it to obtain the grants and to clear the title involved, and that also was done with heavy support from pro bono partners. As the money began to come out, of course, so did the predators, and so we had to very quickly mobilize, again with pro bono support, to combat contractor fraud, to prevent people from being victimized twice, once by the hurricane, another time by unscrupulous contractors. Finally, we had to do a fair amount of work on infrastructure response, particularly where it was tied to targets of benefiting low and moderate income households and communities. And when it comes to Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, There are some important differences. Maria was a much more severe storm. It was significantly more powerful when it landed um, on the island of Puerto Rico. As far as the cost goes, for just the island, it was a significant, very large devastation. It was about 2/3 of the total cost of Hurricane Katrina, which spread across several states: Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And in terms of the housing damage, again, it was in the range of about half the total of the entire northern Gulf region, which again signals in each case that Maria was a very, very powerful and devastating and expensive event. Now, when it comes to Maria and disaster recovery money, it's important to take stock a little bit of what the $20 billion in community development block grant money that's for disaster response looks like to those who've been administering annual community development block grant money in Puerto Rico. 20 billion is 165 times more money than those folks have had to administer in the past 5 years altogether. Puerto Rico Housing as an entity has had zero prior experience administering CDBG, and it will be outsourcing to contractors to develop and implement action plans. At this time, according to various Inspector General reports and public reports, HUD lacks adequate guidance to assess the capacity and unmet needs internally and also in the entities carrying out the recovery on the island. And HUD itself lacks comprehensive monitoring plans for the disaster recovery money, and it itself is understaffed to oversee it. So there are real risks built into the large amount of money thrown at Puerto Rico and the poor internal and oversight resources for ensuring that that money is spent appropriately. There are some real risks, which are that the housing programs that are proposed don't align with the actual unmet needs. This was an issue we found in Mississippi. You may find that the floodplain maps displace residents based on flawed data. At times, that data can be accurate, and then at other times, it can misstate where the actual line should be drawn for a risk. Also a problem that we saw in Mississippi and Katrina. With this large amount of money, there's a big risk of the funds being diverted to non-disaster response priorities. In other words, pet projects of government leaders that they haven't been able to find funding for elsewhere. The risk also exists of the loss of oversight opportunities. When Puerto Rico outsources the design and implementation of these programs, and then when HUD itself is so weak, there are big risks in the systems. There is, at this time, and will be in the future, a big risk of fresh damage from subsequent disasters, either more hurricanes or earthquakes or other natural or man-made disasters. There also is the risk, due to the sort of civic strains on the island, that there will be a lost chance to put disaster resilience and local empowerment into the recovery. Now, when we did our work in Mississippi, we were working in the shadow of New Orleans and against the headwinds of a very successful and well-connected governor. So for us to make the case that he had left people out of the recovery, we had to find compelling personal stories. This is an example of one of those, a gentleman who was living in a formaldehyde-infested FEMA trailer because his home, which he had built himself with scraps from the lumberyard where he had worked for 40 plus years, was blown apart by a tornado inside Hurricane Katrina, and he was ineligible for any assistance. So we pointed out to the reporter that he lived 5 minutes away from a field full of Katrina cottages that were empty and intended to help people just like this gentleman. And this helped to shine an important light on the disconnect between the assurances to the public about recovery and the actual lives of people who fall through the cracks. Another example was this gentleman who lost his legs to diabetes, lost his daughter to, I think, suicide, and lost his home to a tornado that spun out of Katrina. We worked very hard to get him onto the radar of those who were meeting unmet needs. There's other stories like that, but your lesson here is to keep an ear tuned for truly compelling, tragic stories and use them to highlight the importance of the policy objectives you have. And one of the biggest difficulties for me individually as a disaster housing advocate was finding the appropriate place to straddle between being the opponent and being a partner. And the objective here is to find a place to partner when it is advantageous to you and those whom you serve. I think one way to avoid being compromised is to avoid depending upon the opponent for any funding. So you would want to refuse opportunities to be co-opted financially. Some strategies that can work when you seem to be at complete loss of success is to say, let's at least see if we can narrow the area of our disagreement. Let's find out how far apart we actually are on the data. Another one is, let's look at the programs you're doing and let's find a way for our legal aid folks to make sure the programs work effectively. Let us talk with you about ironing out wrinkles and problems in the way that you handle storm victims as clients. And then finally, you can look at the issues of pairing their needs with yours. So one of the needs in Mississippi after the hurricane was to increase the workforce at shipyards and other large facilities. And so we encouraged them to increase workforce housing. On data, it's really important to get a baseline damage and to, if possible, have comparison data. So Puerto Rico being on the island and not on the mainland, it may not seem intuitive to look at the levels of damage in Texas and in other storms that happened around Maria, but I encourage you to look at that because it helps give you a useful yardstick of how severe the storm is and whom to target and why one program versus another may be advisable. So that was one of the things we did by looking at the Mississippi versus Louisiana data in particular. Another thing to keep in mind when thinking about your disaster recovery appropriation is to recognize that over the course of the entire recovery for Hurricane Katrina, $20 billion was allocated for all of the states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. And that is roughly equal to what Puerto Rico has been allocated in connection with Maria. So it's a large amount of money, and it's a big challenge to keep track of how you spend it. One of the ways that we used to keep track was to compare how Mississippi was doing according to federally imposed requirements, like how much of its money was being spent on housing versus other uses, and how much of the money that had been allocated has actually been spent out. And in this case, what we showed was that despite what Mississippi leadership was saying, Mississippi was lagging behind Louisiana in spending its total amount of disaster recovery money. And that's pretty remarkable given that Louisiana got a late start in receiving the amount of money that it needed. Another way to do it is to look at how Mississippi, or Puerto Rico in your case, inflates the numbers on housing, because you'll often see them count non-housing related spending as housing, such as in this case insurance subsidies for homeowners insurance premiums or utility subsidies to keep down the cost of utilities, and they'll count that as housing repair when it's not. So we backed that out, and that's what helped to shrink their number. Another thing that will happen that's useful to keep track of is that early on there will be policy statements that lay out valuable equity goals. And you'll see one here in this report from the Mississippi Governor's Commission. And then comparing that with, or contrasting that with what Mississippi did in connection with that goal. And in our state, the poorest state in the nation, we sought over and over to duck the priority of addressing the needs of low-income, low-wealth residents by seeking waivers of the 50% requirement. And just for purposes of the detail, here is an example of what that language ends up looking like. It requires 50% of the funds to be spent to benefit low and moderate income persons. And then what happens is that the federal agency permits waivers of standards, but then in some cases, if you holler loud enough, you can get HUD to tighten up, and that's what we did here. Initially, the state of Mississippi attempted to get all of its activities carried out under an objective that would waive the requirement to primarily benefit low and moderate income people. And because we pressed on that, we were able to further press on other waivers that the state got in areas of infrastructure, economic development, and community revitalization. In each case, waivers that originally were granted were later rescinded, and that was for a total of about $1.2 billion. Something else that's important in disaster response is community leadership, community voice, and community vision for its own recovery. Here's an example of a community-generated plan being presented to then EPA Director Lisa Jackson for an historic community, Turkey Creek in North Gulfport, that was originally settled by emancipated slaves in the mid-1860s. So that's a series of different kinds of strategies that you're likely to encounter and challenges you're likely to face. One of the things you'll want to do to track the money is to look for the expenditure overviews and see how the money is allocated over time. Here's a place where Mississippi and Puerto Rico differed significantly. Over 5 years, Mississippi did not have an overall action plan allocating between housing and other priorities. It was basically a set of individual plans turned over like playing cards over the course of several years. Whereas for Puerto Rico, there was a pretty substantial breakdown of programs, issue by issue, need by need, and that's an important beginning point that hopefully will help prevent some of the abuses that we experienced in Mississippi. Keeping track of that and seeing if those monies get out of balance is an important feature. We did that here by showing how over time Mississippi spent less on housing, whereas in Louisiana they spent more. And so again, it's important to keep track of the numbers for the for Puerto Rico itself, but it is always important to have a point of comparison. So find a mainland state from the same vintage that's doing this work and draw useful comparisons to help you make your advocacy points. We incorporated these in a series of annual report cards that helped us build a narrative to combat the state's concocted narrative of success. The other thing we did was get invited to provide oversight testimony to congressional committees and subcommittees. And this was really valuable because this was essentially the only place where state officials could be called to account for things and where they could be, in effect, cross-examined. These reports can also be helpful in moving the debate at the national level, which then can ultimately move the debate back home. And that's essentially what we had to do because the local newspapers were very much in the corner of the state leadership, and it was not until we got the New York Times to line up with our assessment of Mississippi's shortcomings that the state began to see local editorial misgivings. And so that's what you see there. We need to reappraise our housing plans. And so print media is one way, but you also need to do radio, specialty publications. For example, we had some very successful coverage in The Root, which was at the time a premier and still is a great African-American focused publication. And then we also were included, part of our story was included in the second installment of the HBO program directed by Spike Lee, If God is Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. It also is really important to find congressional champions, and in our case, Maxine Waters and Barney Frank were both powerful champions for our needs and lined up support that signaled to state officials that they had gone too far with some of their actions. And so this letter here was a product of some of the congressional oversight hearings and helped to dampen the state's zeal in diverting funds from housing to other purposes. A key thing for us was to find a quick way to depict and tell a story of embedded racial injustice and unmet need. And we did that through some comparisons of African American population concentrations and unrepaired homes. And in this case, the larger the orange circle, the more unrepaired homes there are. The darker the green, the more African American the population. So we then did some pull-out maps to show how this lined up so extraordinarily closely with the racially segregated patterns of residential settlement. And that helped carry the day with the HUD leadership. And then when the program that came from that conversation came to an end, we got it mapped again. And lo and behold, across 15 states, the same problem showed up over and over and over again. The same concentrations of unmet housing need. In this case, these are homes repaired as a result of the program, located in predominantly African American parts of the Deep South. The key thing in this map is we were able to move the eligibility more than 100 miles inland to cover people who were not on the Gulf Coast, but were damaged by Hurricane Katrina's winds and tornadoes. It can be very helpful if you're dealing with poverty and race to highlight the sort of sharp geographic boundaries that exist. And in Mississippi, as in a lot of the United States, that involves racial axis, oftentimes along the railroad or the river. So here's the railroad tracks about a block or so off the beach in my hometown in Gulfport. In the lower right-hand corner, you see it's a white neighborhood south of the tracks, black north of the tracks. Here's the storm surge that came in 20 to 25 feet high and flooded a white family out of that house and across the railroad tracks in the middle of the storm to an elderly black woman's cottage where they took refuge. Really helpful to be able to have a concise story like that that explains the injustice of the situation, because that white family got the full amount of disaster recovery aid that was possibly available, whereas that black woman received nothing. Switching topics now to job creation and infrastructure, we spent a certain amount of time on popping the bubble of job creation forecasts by state officials. At one point in this expansion of the state port, they claimed that as many as almost 13,000 new jobs would be created. The harder we pressed on this and the closer it came to a HUD monitoring visit, the more precipitous the fall was for the job creation forecast, as seen here. Ultimately, what ended up happening was that as a result of several years' worth of advocacy, HUD essentially put the state agency on probation, requiring them to more intensively document their job creation and job retention forecasts and imposing a more intrusive reporting and monitoring regime. And so here are some of the examples, some of the details of that. Wrapping up here now, when you have these large infrastructure projects, one of the issues that will come up is the issue of environmental injustice. And in this case, the state port's proposal to expand the port and increase train and truck traffic involved environmental oversight. And when it had to assess that, it claimed that there were no adverse racial injustice effects because the location where the port was found was not an area of high concentration for African American or poor people. And they were looking in a census tract that borders the widest part of town, the same place where that house was you saw on a slide a minute or two ago. The problem was that they weren't looking where the railroad was going or where the connector road was going. And so therefore, we were able to demonstrate that those areas, which are all in darker blue, had higher African American populations and were much more impoverished. One other thing to keep track of as you have these large dollar investments across a bunch of different programs is to see how much money the state or the island spends on job creation and how much per job is spent. And in this case, we used a law student and a lot of guidance from me to put together a map that, a table that showed that when it came to the port, the state was spending dramatically more per job to hold on to these jobs, and the remaining expenditures were far, far less. So there is a sort of an upper limit threshold for spending block grant dollars and to create jobs, and it's $50,000. And as you can see, the non-port expenditures work out to just a hair under $50,000 per job created, whereas for the port, it's, what is that? That's more than 5 times higher. At any rate, this is a very hasty overview of a variety of the difficult challenges that lie ahead for people doing disaster response equity advocacy. Thanks very much for your time.